Hello from ASCO GU 2019 in San Francisco to this e-cancer expert discussion. We have a great panel of experts in bladder cancer today. I'm Matt Galsky. I'm a medical oncologist in New York. We have Dr. Ananya Choudhury from the UK, Dr. Andrea Necchi from Italy, and Dr. Joaquim Bellmunt from Spain. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the abstracts that have been presented today and contextualize that information with the evolving landscape of treatment for urothelial cancer. So one of the first abstracts that I wanted to talk about is something that as a medical oncologist I haven't really appreciated, I don't think that much over the years, which is this issue of local recurrence after treatment with cystectomy for muscle-invasive bladder cancer. My general sense is that recurrent systemic relapse is the major problem, but I think that we've seen some compelling data, observational data, that maybe we've underestimated the impact of local recurrence. And so today we heard an abstract which was a retrospective look at a subset of patients who were enrolled on a randomized study in Egypt, looking at the potential role for chemoradiation as adjuvant treatment in this patient population. Dr. Choudhury, what did you think of that abstract?
I thought it was a very interesting abstract. Professor GU and his team have previously presented data suggesting that there is a role for adjuvant radiotherapy without any radiosensitization in high-risk patients who have aggressive features post-cystectomy. And this abstract that was presented today suggests that rather than radiotherapy alone, there may actually be a role for adjuvant chemotherapy sandwiched either side of a relatively low dose of radiotherapy to the pelvis. And what the abstract showed was that patients who were randomized to receive the combination of chemotherapy, radiotherapy, chemotherapy did better than patients who were treated with radiotherapy alone. I think it's an interesting study. I think the numbers are small, and the data that was presented today is a subgroup analysis because the data presented today showed results in patients who had urothelial cancer, whereas a majority of patients in Egypt actually present with squamous cell carcinoma. There were differences in the way the patients would be treated compared to how they're treated in the UK and Europe and the US, whereas these patients did not get neoadjuvant chemotherapy, and we would normally give patients neoadjuvant chemotherapy before they proceeded to any radical treatment. But I do think it potentially strengthens the hypothesis for looking at a study to see if there is merit in giving adjuvant treatment post-cystectomy. There's been a number of studies attempted around the world. At the moment, there is a study open in Europe. There's two studies open in Europe, one in France and one in Belgium, and there's a study open in India. But the US tried to open a study and failed to recruit. That's right. And I think what would be interesting actually would be to see what other colleagues thought about this data and whether it compelled them to revisit the question.
Dr. Bellmunt, your impression of the data? The patient population was restricted to patients less than 70, which that and the issue of potential differences in urothelial cancer in the US versus Egypt. We think about squamous cell cancer as being potentially different. Do you think there's a difference in the urothelial cancers they're saying there as well?
Well, I think that the time that this trial was designed, squamous cell carcinoma was the most frequent histology, and they were concerned for local recurrence because squamous tend to do much more frequently local recurrence. This is why they randomized radiation therapy versus radiation plus chemotherapy, because as has been asked during the presentation, why neoadjuvant chemotherapy was not given, why they did not randomize chemotherapy versus chemoradiation therapy. That would have been what we believe is the rationale in urothelial cancer world outside Egypt. But we know that the pathology has changed in Egypt. They are no longer seeing squamous cell carcinoma because it's of this parasite that was producing this type of tumor. and then what they have done is just this post-hoc analysis in the patients with urothelial cancer with all these limitations. But I think it's a good point, because it's restricted to urothelial and patients that having non-squamous histology. And yeah, it's information that is relevant in terms of radiation therapy might prevent recurrence. It's something that we have forgotten, and maybe it's being rescued now, this concept.
I mean, I guess as a clinical oncologist, I'd be keen to promote bladder preservation as the first line of treatment for appropriate patients, rather than go looking at patients post-cystectomy. I think the question that you asked about whether these patients are genetically different is really interesting. I'm not aware of a lot of data out there comparing the same histology related to, I guess, the ethnicity of the patients, but we know certainly in other cancers that the outcomes of different cancers and their treatments do differ from country to country, even when it seems that the treatment they're getting is the same.
Well, I think that overall this data allows, once again, the need for a multidisciplinary collaboration in these patients with local or local advanced disease, and mainly the need to open the door also for the multidisciplinary collaboration between medical oncologists and radiation oncologists, and not only urologists outside of the UK world. In managing properly this patient population.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think we're seeing more of that each year at these meetings. I think we're seeing more of that. Dr. Necchi, you've been a leader in the development of immune checkpoint blockade in the clinically localized muscle invasive setting. And today we heard updated results moving immune checkpoint blockade even earlier to the non-muscle invasive disease setting in BCG unresponsive patients. Do you think there's an unmet need there? And what's your take on the data that was presented today?
Yeah, June Ballard basically presented data that are in line with those already presented last year at the ESMO meeting and also at the SUO meeting, showing that there is an interesting rate of complete responses that is pretty much in line with the rate of CR obtained in a bit more advanced disease like a muscle invasive disease, 40%. And in particular, these responses seem to be sustained over time, because the trial is reaching the most important endpoint of the complete response at 3 months, or the sustained response at 6 months, or even beyond this time period. So at least in the proportion of patients for whom the data have been presented, so patients with T1 disease plus CIS, the early data with single agent activity, with single agent drug are promising, pending the results of biomarkers that may guide us in being more able to select patients more properly to achieve even higher results in terms of CR and maintain CR over time. But they are interesting, and I like the fact that probably in the next future, patients with early high-risk disease may be considered, all those who have a non-muscle invasive high-risk disease and early muscle invasive disease, to be considered all together for clinical trials.
Dr. Bellmunt, the follow-up study that we heard about today from the pembrolizumab presentation is moving treatment even earlier, and so this might be one of the only data sets in the BCG unresponsive setting, single-arm study. Do you think this is practice changing?
Well, I think it's the data, as Andreas has mentioned, is compelling. So the 40% response, complete responses in patients that have CIS, that means those patients tend to progress and are candidates for cystectomy. That's really striking. This is at 3 months. So the most important thing is how these responses are durable. Some data was presented that some patients are still maintaining this complete response at 9 months. And this is really interesting data, but still this is a part of the whole trial. So there are 3 cohorts. The cohort that was presented, that was already presented at ASCO, is an update, and it's reassuring, meaning that there is strong rationale for investing with immunotherapy in this setting. So it looks like if we are moving earlier and earlier, immunotherapy is working much better initially. So and I think that obviously we need to be really happy, and patients need to get this under consideration for the future, because no one wants to get rid of the bladder, right? So the side effects, quality of life. So if this is a treatment paradigm shift, then it's going to change the life of a lot of patients.
And toxicity concerns in this patient population, given what you saw today, and assuming that these treatments become commercially available for this disease population in the future, you feel comfortable giving them in this disease state?
Well, I believe that the profile is similar as what has been observed in second line, so there is no unexpected or side effects that are of concern. Obviously, all the time experience on giving these agents is crucial, and we are all learning on how to manage side effects. And if you early recognize a potential life-threatening side effects, you are able just to block that and then not create grade 5 side effects that sometimes, well, those grade 5 were seen in the very beginning when we didn't know that these agents could produce pneumonitis or severe colitis and so on. Yeah,
it does seem like over time these data sets, the risk for those severe events seems to be getting lower and lower. Dr. Choudhury?
Well, I was going to say on that point that I think although the data is incredibly interesting and compelling, I think the follow-up is short. Yes. So I think it's important not just to work out what the complete response rate is long-term, but also to get a bit of an idea about what the chronic long-term effects may be with immunotherapy in this group of patients. Because these patients, in lots of ways, are going to live a full and long life compared to a lot of the patients that we've been treating in the metastatic setting. So I think that becomes a real important part of the discussion.
What's the role for radiation in these patients currently, and is there another opportunity to bring in radiation given what we know about the potential for radiation to combine with immune checkpoint blockade?
So I think the role of radiation in this group of patients is very interesting and is almost having a little bit of a rebirth. So there has been increasing interest in whether the radiation, especially with radiosensitization, could be useful in non-muscle invasive high-risk cancer. So it could be possible to treat these patients with radiotherapy combined with radiosensitization. The data that we use not to treat these patients comes from a very old study with old radiotherapy techniques and without radiosensitization, where radiotherapy was shown to be as good as BCG in controlling the disease, but no better. And the other thing that we don't know is we don't know whether it works on a different group of patients. So it may be that the patients who respond to BCG are not the patients who would respond to radiotherapy. I think it would be very interesting to develop almost a multi-arm trial, a bit maybe in the bit like Stampede in prostate cancer, whereby we could test a number of different treatment options for these patients in one go in an efficient way, because we have the patient numbers, and I think there's a need to try different combinations of treatments.
So there's one such study going on in the United States like that, although it's a multi-arm study, but less of a multi-stage study. But one of the arms in that study is a combination of immune checkpoint blockade and radiation in the BCG unresponsive disease state and lower dose radiation. And so certainly something to watch.
Yes, I think that'd be very interesting.
So there was also an interesting poster regarding the BCG response and the tumor mutational burden that was by a group from Brazil. So it looks like as more tumor mutational burden you have, you are more likely to respond to BCG. But those are patients that initially receive BCG. So who knows, in this like refractory still TMB is there. So there might be a synergistic effect with the BCG and radiation therapy and immunotherapy.
Absolutely, and I think we are beginning to learn what the potential synergies could be with radiotherapy and immunotherapy. So there will be a number of studies, I think, that will report over the next year or two that will give us an indication as to the safety profile of combining radiotherapy with immunotherapy, and also give us some tantalizing results as to whether there is a response as well.
Of course, the possibility to have a new drug that is active in the CIS component may be critically important in order to expand the role of radiotherapy also in this population that was always considered as not eligible for, or is not most suited for a radiotherapy approach.
We've been hearing more and more at these meetings about antibody-drug conjugates, and today we heard an update of phase 2 trial, single-arm trial with sacituzumab govitecan on antibody-drug conjugate. that has shown activity in triple-negative breast cancer as well. Dr. Necchi, what's your take on that data, in what's the landscape of ADCs in urothelial cancer? Yeah. Where's the place for them in our treatment?
Well, the data are compelling because we are dealing with the response rate in pretreated population that are over the expected proportion of 20–25%. We are reaching 30%. Of course, the data are very early in their development because we are dealing still with a few patients, with 45 patients. But overall, it's nice to see that we may have enfortumab vedotin, sacituzumab, on the other side, as presented today, that may be available for all comers, for unselected patients on one side, and on the other side we may have a similar activity in more selected, molecularly selected patients, like those that are suited for targeted therapy like FGF receptor targeting. So the landscape will be probably driven by the biomarker selection on one side. Patient with a biomarker-driven disease may be probably more suited for a targeted therapy approach first, but the possibility to have a rescue with more than active compound that may be available for all comers, it may be, I guess, a good option for those who cannot receive or who fail the targeted therapy for their tumor, or cannot receive because they don't have any mutation. On top of that, there is immunotherapy, of course, and so we are opening the door to combinations, and combination just behind the corner with these compounds, including antibody-drug conjugates with immunotherapy. And there is a plethora of phase 1–2 trials that are ongoing or in plan in every clinical stage, I would say, except at this stage, except for the early stage disease. So the data are early anticipated and are awaited, and basically it will always all depend on most will depend on the biomarker selection.
Dr. Bellmunt, it's conceivable that we'll have approvals for FGFR inhibitors and ADCs around the same time. So you have a patient with an FGFR3 mutation. Which drug do you choose?
That's a good question. So I think both these drugs, they have received this breakthrough designation by FDA. And maybe it's not going to be one before the other. They might be competing. So enfortumab vedotin, it has this antibody against Nectin-4 that is widely expressed in bladder cancer. So you don't need to screen the patient. The second compound presented today, it's against the topo2. It's also highly expressed in bladder cancer, and the response rate, the enfortumab is 40%. For this one today was 31%. Still a lot need to be learned. What's the impact of immunotherapy before receiving these agents? There are limited data. For targeted therapies, we have a lot of now under development, FGFR3 inhibitors or pan-FGFR inhibitors. Erdafitinib has this 35–40% response rate in selected patients that have mutations or translocations. So you need to select from the whole patient population. This sometimes is like in between 20–25% of patients having FGFR3 alterations, genomic alterations. The most frequently described to be a driving potential response to these compounds is the mutations and translocations. But then for those who are selected, we still probably don't have the good biomarker, because even selecting these patients for translocations and mutations, still we only see 35–40% responses. So we are going down. So we'll see. I think that now more trials need to be generated, because all these compounds combined with immunotherapy, as you have mentioned, probably are going to expand the way that we treat patients, and the patients are going to derive benefit from all these sequential. Not sequential. Who knows what's best? To start with an FGFR inhibitor or one of these antibody-drug conjugates. So
you brought up an important point about the response rates maybe creeping down a little bit as the sample sizes increase. We've seen response rates in the 20–30% range dating back a couple decades with cytotoxic chemotherapy. Is your gut feeling, based on seeing the data, based on seeing durations of response, do you think these drugs are different?
Probably those are a bit different. So the median duration of response for erdafitinib, and those patients have received 2 or 3 lines of therapy, is 5.4 months. So it's more than what you expect to see with second-line chemotherapy, that is 4.5. So it's a bit longer, but it's not as long as you would like to see. And maybe immunotherapy or combining antibody-drug conjugates plus immunotherapy, we are going to see long-term response. So yeah, checkpoint inhibitor, targeted therapies is we have experience with lung cancer. So some patients deriving a nice response, but those responses are limited. At some point, the tumor develop new mutations and progress under treatment.
I think it would be very good for us to accumulate data and we will presumably accumulate data in the next future regarding the likelihood of response and to get benefit also to chemotherapy or antibody-drug conjugate in patients who are molecularly selected according to FGF receptor alteration. There may be some signal that may suggest that this patient population not only are predicted poor responders to immunotherapy, but may be poor responders also to chemotherapy or to other drugs. And this information will be critical in order to be able for us to select the right strategy and the right sequence for to discuss with this patient.
I think, though, we should have a little note of caution about the robustness of the biomarkers that we're using to stratify the patients. I think we have had our fingers burnt in the past where we've assumed that we have a robust predictive biomarker. We've used it to enrich a population or even used it to direct treatment within a clinical trial, and we've had a negative result. And we've also shown that a lot of these agents actually work in patients who would be biomarker negative. So I think before we jump straight in with stratifying the patients with the biomarkers, that we should just make sure that we have not only a robust methodology behind the biomarker, but we're sure that the biomarker is predictive, not prognostic.
Excellent point. We heard an update of the RANGE study today, a study which explored the role of anti-angiogenic treatment combined with chemotherapy in the post-platinum setting. We don't have many randomized phase 3 studies in this disease that have met their primary endpoint. And here we have a study that met its primary endpoint that thus far hasn't had a significant impact on clinical practice. What's your impression? Why do you think that is?
So yeah, we all know that the RANGE trial was positive as per trial design. That was progression-free survival based on the investigator assessment, and it was the endpoint was met. But the point is, this endpoint was statistically significant. The other question is this clinically relevant, because it was 1.5 months improvement in PFS, and then linked to that, the overall survival was negative. And I think that the presentation of today has been very relevant, because we all learned from negative trials, and what they have done is they have gone back and analyzed the PK, the prognostic factors of all these patients, and in fact, if you optimize the dose in these patients, you get an overall survival benefit. So, and this has been shown in gastric cancer and colorectal cancer, other cancers with ramucirumab. I think that presentation that linked the PK, so the levels of the ramucirumab, with the prognostic factors, meaning that if you have several adverse prognostic factors, maybe the metabolism of the drug changes, and this might lead not to the sufficient amount of activity for this drug. And I think it was really nice analysis, despite this is in retrospective, but maybe we, in the future, despite what you have mentioned, we have no perfect biomarkers, but we need to start stratifying patients based on prognostic factors, predictive factors, genomic correlates, and so on, because maybe we will be able to select this specific subgroup of patients that derive benefit, despite the drug being not positive for the whole patient population. Right?
Joaquim, do you think that this data may be able to rescue the interest toward the anti-angiogenesis targeting in this patient, or based on the landscape of new drugs that are coming in the ground of the therapeutic possibilities in this in the urothelial cancer, or what is your impression regarding the possibility to still use the drug like ramucirumab in this patient population combined with chemotherapy?
So I think that despite all these anti-angiogenic trials, adding an anti-angiogenic trial, have been negative, and we need to hear about the CLCP trial in first line that I have heard news that probably are not satisfactory, the results. But because there are subsets of patients, and you have experience with pazopanib, seeing some patients with outstanding responses, long-lasting. I have the sunitinib trial. I remember a patient having a long-term responses, and you have also experience with anti-angiogenic that specific patients derive benefit of specific agents. So it might be that the next step, if the company is willing just to invest in bladder, you just probably select patients, monitor the thresholds, the Cmax of the drug, and so on. This might be the future, personalized medicine. So all the medicines are not useful for all patients.
So still maybe a role.
Yeah.
So with that, we're going to complete our discussion. Thank you for joining this eCancer expert panel.